Hello my friends, this is Sarah from Weird Horizon, where we explore topics on the spooky, the esoteric, the countercultural and the just plain weird. And today we're going to be once again continuing our exploration on an interesting web-based phenomena, something that sits midway between a form of spirituality and the paranormal, being reality shifting, with a particular focus on the sub-community within it, Harry Potter shifting. Today we're going to be exploring how far we can describe reality shifting as a form of maladaptive daydreaming, before moving on to a case of a seemingly post-COVID upswing in transmissible mental health struggles facilitated through TikTok. So we're going to be questioning whether reality shifting can be seen as a form of intrusive mental health crisis, similar to maladaptive daydreaming, and whether it can be potentially spread through excessive social media use. So this episode will make use of a number of recent studies on the phenomena, namely reality shifting psychological features of an emergent online daydreaming culture by Eli Summer et al., as well as the snappily titled Heightened Levels of Maladaptive Daydreaming are Associated with COVID-19 Lockdown, Pre-Existing Psychiatric Diagnoses and Intensified Psychological Dysfunctions, a multi-country study, also by Eli Summer et al. So I will also reference a number of papers on rapid onset mental health problems during the COVID-19 pandemic, namely functional movement disorders triggered by reality shifting and the backrooms and other social media traps. I will link this one in my show notes. I am not going to attempt to pronounce the authors of this paper because I will do it wrong, as well as rapid onset functional tic-like behaviours in young females during the COVID-19 pandemic by Tamara Pringsheim, MD et al. But once again, I will stress I'm not a psychologist. I'm not trying to make the point that those practicing reality shifting or interested in it are necessarily mentally ill. I'm also not trying to caricature those in the community, as it is a huge and diverse community, but there will be instances where we will talk about specific subsets of the community when referenced in specific studies. But with that out of the way, let's get on with it. So as we spoke of last week, there is a debate as to where exactly on the spectrum reality shifting falls between normal imaginative escapism and something more chronic or compulsive. So ignoring the key belief at the centre of it, i.e. that this is a scientifically provable practice, and also ignoring how far and how truthfully practitioners may believe in the idea that they can physically, scientifically shift their consciousness to a number of alternate realities in the multiverse. Reality shifting in practice can be seen as a form of highly detailed daydreaming. So in order to facilitate a shift, there are a number of methods shared to improve levels of perceived emotion and help one feel more present in their new reality, as well as take comfort in the construction of said perfect world as a means of temporary total escape. So within the community, there are those who practice reality shifting as a way of engaging with the fandom community they enjoy, as a framework for an immersive and rewarding diversion. But as with pretty much anything, there are those who feel as if they've lost control over what may have ostensibly started as a hobby and have started to feel like reality shifting brings them more harm than good. So although far from ubiquitous, there are those within the community for whom reality shifting is an addictive response to trauma and one which negatively affects their day-to-day life. An ex-shifter interviewed for Insider said that she stopped as shifting had become for her an obsession and that she, quote, stopped liking things in her day-to-day reality due to being constantly preoccupied with her desired reality, how to get there, and what she would do there. So loss of enjoyment in things usually enjoyed, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is a key indicator of declining mental health, particularly depression. And in a Reddit AMA of a shifter, they described having used shifting as a way to travel to a time in their past where they felt they were at their best. To quote, "I used to have this reality I shifted to just to escape life. It's an alternate reality of this one and only has a time span of about 2 years. I shift into events that have already happened and I just relive those 2 years over and over again. Why? Because those were the best 2 years of my life." But this same shifter acknowledges that the more time spent in their desired reality, in this case just a small section of their own life and their own past, the less connected they felt to their current reality. "I would say I forgot about my original reality, but I just felt less attached to everything and everyone there." So others who left the community also mentioned finding themselves neglecting and attempting to detach themselves from their reality in the hope that they may find a way to permanently live in their desired reality through respawning or perma-shifting. So in investing more and more emotional effort into their desired reality, their life deteriorated further and further exacerbated the contrast between the two. Ex-shifter Sarah told Insider that shifting kind of like how people describe drugs. The higher the euphoria, the lower the crash. So many within the community report that shifting made pre-existing mental health struggles worse. Of course, this is a self-reported thing that we are talking about, though. But this is a sentiment echoed by clinical psychologists such as Joshua Claypow, who says this: "Like any other behaviour, the more shifting dominates, the more it leads to an unbalanced and unhealthy life. For those at risk of dissociative conditions, such as psychosis, can potentially make the condition worse." And this description, this intrusive, disruptive behaviour, also perfectly describes something which we may class certain instances of reality shifting as a form of maladaptive daydreaming. So maladaptive daydreaming is defined as a psychological form of immersive daydreaming which interferes with a person's life. To quote, "In other words, like most psychological phenomena, reality shifting might span from voluntary, controlled mentation to psychological fantasizing associated with distress or impairment. And as an avoidant coping mechanism, it is not surprising that COVID resulted in a huge rise in maladaptive daydreaming in clinical settings, just as it did with reality shifting. However, maladaptive daydreaming falls in the space where a normal diversionary practice, i.e. daydreaming, becomes something harmful to day-to-day life, and reality shifting does not inherently trend towards this. There are many who practice reality shifting and believe it to be a solely positive impact on their life. To summarize with a quote, "The core difference between maladaptive daydreaming and reality shifting is that maladaptive daydreaming is an unhealthy, addictive response to trauma that produces high levels of distress and impairment to day-to-day life, while reality shifting appears not to." However, I will say that in terms of a mental practice, reality shifting is very new. So we really do not have a lot of information about how this will sit with people long term, but it's something that we may find a bit more out as time passes. However, even though there are differences between the two, as we can see right now, reality shifting and maladaptive daydreaming do have some very notable similarities, which is why I'm talking about them both today. Even when reality shifting is practiced in a quote-unquote safe, positive way that doesn't cause distress. So this description comes from a Discussing Psychology article on the similarities and differences between the two. So both are characterized by spending hours engaged in elaborate mental plots, often based on popular works of fiction, extremely vivid fantasies engaging multiple senses, reduced awareness of the physical world, use of music to trigger daydreaming and facilitate immersion, and kinesthetic movements such as acting out parts of the fantasy to enhance the experience. But a very key point of difference we should stress is that those living with maladaptive daydreaming know that these realities are not real, but the compulsion to experience them is chronic and interferes with their lives. With reality shifting, practitioners appear to believe that the realities they are traveling to are real. It is central to this kind of core belief in the scientific possibility of shifting realities through mental effort and being able to live in already existing fictional worlds. If we believe reality shifting in that they truly have this core belief at the center of it, reality shifters believe these worlds to be real and existing, whereas maladaptive daydreamers know them to be fantasies. What's more, with maladaptive daydreaming, the practice is one that is compulsive, secretive, and often a source of great shame, whether a person's practice of it is discovered or not. And this is a particular point of contrast with reality shifting, where the practice is often social and often shared online voluntarily. So the specific details of the desired reality are often shared in order to help others, often involving some very specific and private information with people's shared scripts. Reality shifting, born as it is primarily from TikTok, is a very social practice, whereas maladaptive daydreaming is a very insular and sort of shameful practice. With reality shifting, though, the most negative feelings seem to be not about doing the practice, but about not being able to do it, or having done it in the past, but being able to now, or also just missing their desired reality, so sort of missing the symptoms of this practice, whereas with maladaptive daydreaming, it's the compulsion that is the issue. So some also engage with this sort of emotional whiplash seemingly caused by accidentally shifting back to their current reality from their desired reality, and in effect ejecting themselves from the dream world and back to one less desired. But in general, reality shifting is not a source of shame as it is with maladaptive daydreaming. It is framed as wholly positive, social, and fulfilling if one is able to do it. So the study, heightened levels of maladaptive daydreaming are associated with COVID-19 lockdown, pre-existing psychiatric diagnoses, and intensified psychological dysfunctions, a multi-country study by Eli Summers, again, et al., to quote, aimed to explore the relationship between maladaptive daydreaming, an addictive mental behaviour to vivid fantasy associated with distress and functional impairment, and forced COVID-19 pandemic-related self-isolation and quarantine. So although this is not exactly analogous to reality shifting, the exploration of a boom in popularity of a compulsive, imaginative, avoidant coping mechanism may tell us a little bit about reality shifting in regards to COVID and this explosion we saw in interest in the topic during the COVID-19 lockdowns. So similar to the levels of self-reported mental health struggles often mentioned as a motivation for shifting and or something to be scripted for or scripted against in one's desired reality, to quote, statistical procedures indicated that individuals with probable maladaptive daydreaming who reported pre-existing anxiety and depression disorders described a greater urge to daydream due to the pandemic and greater difficulty to control this addictive behaviour. So as the reality shifting community only became the size it is after COVID, we don't have the same information about the use of reality shifting pre-COVID and post-COVID and those involved in it fighting their potential increasing urges to do it during COVID, we don't have the same kind of information we have as with maladaptive daydreaming. And to stress again, interest in or practice of reality shifting is not a mental illness or psychological symptoms, but in some cases it does overlap with maladaptive daydreaming and have some very interesting similarities with it. It does seem true that for some, though, reality shifting can become something out of their control and therefore maladaptive, but is not ubiquitous to reality shifting. Sorry if I keep labouring the point, but it is an important distinction to make. But studies of compulsive coping mechanisms during and post-COVID seem to show that the increased levels of stress and social isolations led many to worsening addictive behaviours, leading to some recognising groups such as compulsive gamblers and the like as groups put at risk by the unfolding situation. So we see a similar picture with alcoholism, with one press release indicating that the spike in alcohol consumption in the midst of the pandemic may have led to 8,000 excess deaths in the US alone. And although reality shifting, when used at a low or moderate level, clearly doesn't have the same immediate downsides as gambling or alcoholism, at its worst it is described as not only addicting but avoidant, causing a reduction in the ability to deal with daily stress, choosing instead to escape into a mental world. And this description of the addictive nature of reality shifting is something that we often see, likened to a kind of itch in the back of the brain, only lessened by more and more frequent and intense practice. So this is something we see sort of reported from within the community. For some, it seemed like reality shifting was a kind of last resort for them when they realised that they were at their weakest. From an AMA on subreddit Shifting Realities titled, "I shifted for 7 current reality months to escape this reality's trauma. It's possible and here's my experience." The author says as such, to quote, "There were a variety of factors and trauma in my life that left me emotionally and mentally weak, to the point that I was in one of the darkest places that we can get to. So without thinking, I shifted. Then one day I was watching the stars, thinking about the life I'd created for myself, and I thought to myself, maybe my original reality could improve. I should go back." So from within the community, though, often when the question of addiction is brought up, it is met with pushback. A user in the Shifting Realities subreddit asks if there can be such a thing as shifting obsession, and whether it would really be a bad thing, basically using the correct argument that one can be addicted to anything positive, to the point that it hurts us, i.e. too much of a good thing is exactly that. But the replies seem to come from people deep in the weeds of it, basically boiling down to, if it feels good, do it. The world is fucked anyway. Which, if it isn't a great indication that it can be addictive, I don't know what it is. But they say things like, go on, shift all you want, and most importantly, enjoy it. And by the way, too much of a good thing equals X doesn't apply to every situation. Sometimes it's just a good thing, and that's okay. And if they're getting anxiety over it, then they must have forgotten the fact that they can shift somewhere that the anxiety no longer exists. So I'm not going to pick apart that statement too much because we are most likely talking about comments made by a child, but I'm just going to leave it out there and just say that I think from the responses that people have made about shifting in relation to the question of can this be addicting and can that be a bad thing, I think it's pretty clear from people's responses that it can be, and that there is an awareness of that even when you are deep, deep into it. So I think there can be a little bit of a lack of communication within the community. A lot of the responses can be quite one note, and the community can seem like there is a good way of doing things, a right way of thinking about things, and that's the one good way. And that may have helped to create a sort of cohesive movement, as it were. But another thing that I think we have to think about is timing, whether the timing made it popular. So, like we have explored, COVID was instrumental in picking up this idea and spreading it far and wide. And it may have actually benefited from the isolating environment of COVID, as like we saw with maladaptive daydreaming. Some of the behaviours involved require privacy, the kind of privacy that wasn't always available to a lot of people before widespread isolation. So to quote on the subject of maladaptive daydreaming, because maladaptive daydreaming involves embodying the daydreams, sometimes involving vocalization, gesturing, and kinesthesia, many need to protect their privacy when engaging in this mental activity. Thus, social isolation meant those practicing maladaptive daydreaming had more room to exercise it than they would normally have had, which may have ordinarily been curtailed by social interactions, and the impulse behind them also potentially lessened by said social contact. So the hypothesis of the maladaptive daydreaming survey was as such. During COVID-19, self-isolation and self-quarantine would be positively associated with increased maladaptive daydreaming indices amongst maladaptive daydreamers. Time spent daydreaming, the intensity of daydreaming, the vividness of daydreaming, the urge to daydream. So as a voluntary study, it did not include anyone under the age of 18, which does limit how far we can draw conclusions in relating it to reality shifting. But questions were asked such as things like, how distressed do you currently feel about the current time you spend daydreaming? And then respondents were asked to rate the amount of time they spent daydreaming and the intensity and vividness of this. They were asked to compare it also against their urge to daydreaming before COVID. And if previous to COVID the participants were attempting to control their levels of daydreaming, they were asked how far COVID had impinged on this effort. Now, from the survey, there was some indication, but not conclusive indication, that needing to isolate for COVID resulted in more frequent, longer, and more intense daydreaming, to the point that it could be classed as maladaptive. Maladaptive daydreaming can be seen in those studied as a coping mechanism which had more control over their life during COVID. But although, to quote, hypothetically effective in the short run, this form of coping strategy is essentially avoidant. Avoidant coping style is associated with subsequent elevated anxiety and depression in animals and humans alike. Which again, I think is something we have heard echoed by the few who have left the reality shifting community and chose to speak out about it. It started as a good thing, but ultimately made their situation worse. The study also made an explicit link with another avoidant coping mechanism, problematic smartphone use, which is something we will speak on now, even though it's something that we have been implicitly kind of speaking about this entire time. But the study, Functional Movement Disorders Triggered by Reality Shifting and the Backrooms, Another Social Trap, published in March 2023, presents the case of a young girl struggling with severe functional tics, thought to stem from her use of TikTok and interest in reality shifting and the backrooms. So she was described as always having suffered from a sense of separation from her life, to quote. She sometimes experienced dreamy states, derealization and depersonalization. For example, when she was going outside, as if on autopilot. So her mother also described her as having an artistic personality and a great imagination. Seemingly the foundations for an interest in reality shifting were already there, but the first symptoms to manifest and be picked up on were her physical ones, her tics. To quote, "The tics started abruptly in February 2021 during online learning in the COVID-19 pandemic, and consisted of various motor expressions and complex vocal phenomena that imitated different characters seen, especially those on TikTok, YouTube, memes, or video games. As she was able to use the tics to communicate effectively with friends and classmates, they were increased in frequency alongside her acute interest in reality shifting, horror games, and the backrooms. And I would like to make a comparison here with the compulsive physical movement associated with maladaptive daydreaming, a source of shame which often helped to classify the previously healthy or even desirable immersive daydreaming as the now harmful maladaptive daydreaming. She spent several hours a day on these activities and regularly practiced nighttime affirmations, trying to create a new reality, but as she said, was never able to get there. And at the same time as this, her tics developed into a tremor with medications and mood stabilizers that had a negligible effect in treating it. So we're not going to talk about it here, but the crossover between the reality shifting community and the horror ones is something I found through my research into it again and again, often in the form of warning people against attempting to shift into these worlds, but clearly a concurrent interest in the two was not uncommon. An interest in the backrooms in particular is interesting, as is another popular piece of media which prominently features alternative realities and travelling to them, albeit in the backrooms it is often unwillingly. And just in case you have not heard of the backrooms, to quote, as stated in internet descriptions, entering the backrooms requires no clipping, randomly slipping inside without the player's control by phasing through walls or other solid objects into different video games or realities. So the Backrooms is a shared collaborative fiction project and also designed as a parallel reality. Depictions of them are often based on uncanny realism and the idea of liminal spaces, which usually depict typically busy locations in an unnaturally empty way, such as hallways, office rooms, etc. And I think that the idea that this gained a similar level of popularity in the COVID pandemic has some obvious motivation behind it, and a fairly obvious psychological one. So stemming from a 2019 4chan thread and popularised by a number of viral depictions, see King Pixels on YouTube, it all started from a viral image posted to 4chan with green text accompaniment about accidentally no-clipping out of reality into an infinite void of twisting hallways, mildewy carpets, and emptiness. So a previously functional place with a looming threat of something else being in there with you. So I don't think you would have to try very hard to draw some interesting parallels between it and the COVID-19 pandemic experience. But maybe I will do that in the future with 5 hours of podcast episodes on it. But in summary, the Backrooms was another interest based around alternate realities and how to get there, and engaging with ideas around isolation, liminality, and unnatural depopulation. So the young lady in this case was suffering, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, with a form of functional movement disorder, including an abrupt onset, irregular, distractible, bilateral postural hand tremor consistent with a functional tremor. So treatment for such usually includes psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and specific physical therapy techniques. But in this case, traditional treatment methods seem to have little effect. But when the patient deleted their TikTok account in March 22, and the concurrent lifting of COVID restrictions meant that a return to a somewhat normal life for them, their symptoms, which had been afflicting them for 1.5 years, gradually tapered off with occasional on-demand tics. But there is evidence that this case was not a one-off. So there's a growing level of interest around the idea of functional tics being spread by TikTok use, especially during the concurrent COVID pandemic and associated restrictions and social changes. So from an article, Rapid Onset Functional Tic-like Behaviours in Young Females During the COVID-19 Pandemic, we get this. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, our colleagues working at 8 different Tourette's syndrome clinics globally have witnessed a parallel pandemic of young people aged 12 to 25, almost exclusively girls and women, presenting with the rapid onset of complex motor and vocal tic-like behaviours. However, in their opinion, it is not simply a response to COVID and the myriad of mental health issues it caused across the population, but also explicitly linked to their internet use and the kinds of content that they engaged with. i.e., there seems to be some evidence, at least according to some psychologists, that exposure to certain behaviours online can cause a manifestation of similar symptoms in certain people, even those previously not predisposed to it. So said rapid onset occurred in all participants during the pandemic period, i.e. after March 1st, 2020, and all endorsed exposure to influencers on social media, mainly TikTok with tics or Tourette's. So there is evidence to suggest that existing anxiety and depression can influence it too. To quote, logistic regression controlling for age and sex demonstrated a significant association between the diagnosis of said tics and the diagnosis of an anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. So this is to say that certain rapid onset motor and vocal behaviours exacerbated by social issues, i.e. COVID and pre-existing or resulting anxiety and depression, can seem to be somewhat virally transmitted by frequent contact with certain kinds of media, at least in one case or in the opinion of this study. It is the unprecedented increase in new referrals of young females with the rapid onset of tic-like behaviours since the pandemic started that has been so unusual. And the manifestation, of course, of chronic physical and vocal behaviours shares some overlap with the self-hypnotic aspects of reality shifting. So susceptibility may lend a hand here. To quote, in many cases, a premonitory urge before these tic-like behaviours is endorsed, as are distractibility and suggestibility. So the susceptibility of young women in these cases is notable, as usually tics are more commonly presented at a much younger age, i.e. between 4 to 7 years, and more commonly in males at a rate of about 3-1. And often they would naturally worsen in pre-adolescence and tend to improve in later adolescence. To quote, in this respect, it would be useful to explore whether abnormalities in sense of agency and action monitoring, similar to those observed in people with other functional neurological disorders, are a consistent trait also in these patients, or whether performance on these domains is more variable. So reality shifting is inherently tied in with our sense of agency. It is this which people are seeking to regain in their desired reality, and which they can end up losing in their current reality. And the compulsive, repetitive, and often dissociative aspects can also lead to issues with normal action monitoring. So we've talked a lot about mental health and how it can be tied to reality shifting, but it is not necessarily a problem for all or even many. But when should one seek help? In general, all of those we have spoken of recognized a point at which their use of reality shifting became out of their control, but this may not always be the case. From a Vice article on the potential issues with reality shifting, some concrete signs are highlighted. Key indicators to seek mental health support would be if the shifter experienced anything that created fear for them or challenged their belief system regarding what we would refer to as consensual reality. Also seek help if there is any ongoing drifting into altered states outside of intended shifting sessions. I would also add to this estrangement from the sense of self. Disassociation and depersonalization are key indicators of something being amiss if experienced regularly. What's more, uncontrollable physical symptoms or physical compulsions clearly has a bit of a overlap with other compulsive avoidant mechanisms in certain people when exposed to certain media often. And as a final point, desires to permashift or respawn, tantamount to suicide within the reality shifting community, should always be treated seriously. But with that, we will leave it here today. So that was a pretty long and complicated one, and I think some of the points may have gotten a bit mixed around, but there is a lot of interesting stuff coming out in the psychological community about what these kind of mental health crises may mean for us, and what exactly the lasting effects of the COVID pandemic have had on particularly younger minds, those who grew up without the kind of social interactions that we assume to be essential for healthy development. So we shall see. It is something that we will continue to learn about as time passes. But thank you for joining me once again on our ongoing exploration of reality shifting, a practice that we can still see as a kind of emerging phenomenon. As it is so new, there is not a whole lot we can say for definite about the motivations behind it or the kind of symptoms that arise from it. But I think, at least to me, the evidence is pretty conclusive that there's a lot of factors converging to result in a great many people seeking reality shifting and similar coping mechanisms such as maladaptive daydreaming as an attempt to deal with their situation, and as the widespread imposed isolation exacerbated some compulsions that may have already been there in some or developed in others, particularly under the influence of some viral content around them. How far can social media aid in the viral spread of certain mental illnesses and behaviours is something a lot of very smart people are currently investigating as we speak, because we simply do not know. But it is something I will definitely revisit in the future in another form, I am sure. In the meantime, though, you can find me wherever you consume your podcasts, and you can chat with me on Twitter as Weird Horizon and on Instagram as Weird Horizon Podcasts. Stay spooky, my friends. Much love as always. But for now, bye.